Hello, today I'm going to tell you a bit more about different alternative approaches we can take to answering the extreme weather event attribution question. Now, these broadly fall into three different categories. We have the risk-based approach, which is the approach that we'll be using within this workshop. And you'll have already heard about this from Simon's talk earlier, but the general principle is that we simulate large events as the world with and without human-induced climate change, and we see how the exceedance of a particular threshold changes due to human influences. So we can look to aim to answer what extent anthropogenic climate change has changed the likelihood of occurrence or the occurrence frequency of a particular extreme event. Then we have mechanistic approaches, and these really analyze the details around a particular extreme event. And some people refer to these more as extreme event autopsies. This is where we're really trying to look at the extreme event in terms of its predictability and the large-scale circulation patterns that are having, and determine what the different causal factors that may be acting to cause that extreme event to occur in the first place. So this is really useful for letting us know how these extreme events come about, but the deficiency is it doesn't really tell us how we're changing the likelihood of getting these particular extreme events. Now, a third sort of approach is the circulation-based approaches, and these define the extreme event by its individual circulation state and take analogues of these from models of reanalysis data, and we try and look to see what the change of occurrence of these analog states. So in some sense we define the event based upon the circulation rather than on a particular sort of threshold or determination of the event. And a really important thing to do is to perhaps sort of weave a storyline around why it is that we're seeing these particular different types of extremes occurring, and we can use that to help assess what the role of the thermodynamics as opposed to the dynamics is in getting having the event occur. So you'll probably be quite familiar with this by now, but I thought I'd do another quick recap. This is on the risk-based approach. So here we have a distribution showing a particular maximum temperature in a region for an example heat wave event. And this is from the simulations of the model that were including all anthropogenic forcings. If we then compare this to the simulations where we have removed anthropogenic forcings and only include the natural forcings, then we might get something like the green distribution here. And you can see that they're offset from each other. So if we take a particular event threshold, in this case the dotted black line, and we look to see how likely it is, what's the probability of exceeding that threshold in each of the distributions. Now, another way that we can look at this, because quite often we're squeezed into the tails of the distribution here, is to look as a sort of a rank the distribution and look in terms of the return times, and that's what's shown on the right. It's essentially exactly the same plot, but it has the advantage of highlighting differences in the tails of the distribution. So this time we've got the temperature on the y-axis and the return time, so how rare the event is, on the x-axis. And we can put the same event threshold on this and look to see how the sort of likely chance of seeing the event has changed, and that's the same as taking the probability of exceeding that particular threshold. And we can frame this as a probability ratio. So we're looking at the chance of exceeding the event, that particular event threshold in the world with human-induced climate change over the chance of exceeding the probability of exceeding that event in the world without human influences. Now, another way that we can look at this question, particularly from the return times, is we can say, well, you know, we perhaps are building a piece of infrastructure and we need it to withstand the 1 in 50 year event, say. So we can form another sort of black dotted line on these return times curves and then look to see how the magnitude changes of these particular extreme events. And this isn't a formal term. I just wasn't quite sure what else to call it. So I've called it the magnitude ratio here. And you might look to see how the magnitude of the event has changed due to the human influences. So this is the approach, as I said, that we'll be taking in the workshop, working out probability ratios. But we thought it was also useful to consider some of the different types of approaches that we could take to answering these questions. So we have the mechanistic approach, and the aim here is to look at what are the relevant processes in the that cause this extreme event to occur. What are the drivers of this event? And these can be either local drivers or remote drivers. And they might be something that act on sort of longer or shorter timescales. As I said before, what's the storyline? Why did we get this particular extreme event occurring? And how predictable is this event? And so I've shown here a picture from a paper by Jana Silman. And this really does a good job, I think, of showing how for a particular extreme, how you've got lots of different things acting on it. So you might have different drivers. So these are things like blocking highs, teleconnections, different sea surface temperatures, sea ice, snow cover, those sorts of things. You've also got to take into consideration the initial conditions, so how dry the surface is, you know, what's going on. And then you might have, depending on what sort of event that you're looking at, if you're looking at a windstorm or high precipitation event, then, you know, you might get sort of responses on a fairly short time scale. But if you're looking at maybe things like droughts, these may act over much longer timescales, maybe even multi-annual timescales, and you'd have sort of longer memory through things like, for example, land atmosphere feedbacks occurring. So when we come to thinking about how we're defining the event, this sort of goes back to what Simon was saying earlier. In that we need to think how we're going to define our event in a very sort of general way to encompass the different classes of event that we're seeing. So here's an example paper from Herling et al. Where they used the mechanistic approach and they examined the conditions for the Texas heat wave in 2011 to see basically at the time that the event was occurring. So this is sort of during July through to August, and then looked at the conditions prior to this event occurring as well. So what you can see is that you are looking at the differences in the sea surface temperatures that occurred, and they can then see how the sort of probability changes through subsampling to those that actually had these dry conditions in October to May that we can see here, or the sort of full unconditioned ensemble. And you can see how that's caused a shift in the distribution, so is perhaps increasing the likelihood, or has got a role to play in how we're actually seeing this extreme event. Here's another example. This is a study by Bu and Dong in the recent BAMS special issue supplement, and this was looking at the European heat wave in 2015. And he had quite a neat experimental design, a control period with sort of observed sea surface temperatures, greenhouse gases, and aerosols. A representation for 2015 where he's included again all the observed states with the aerosol and greenhouse gas conditions, and then one where he's only kept the sea surface temperatures, but he's used the sort of climatology period for the greenhouse gases and aerosols. And this is from dividing the experiments, or the simulations that he did in this way, is able to ascertain that anthropogenic forcings were a major factor in setting the conditions for the development of this particular heat wave event.